97% of people will never achieve their goals because they're trying to be disciplined in all the wrong ways. But 2,300 years ago, Epictetus, a slave who became Rome's greatest philosophy teacher, revealed 15 daily practices that create an iron will without the exhausting struggle. These aren't motivational tricks or productivity hacks. They're battle-tested principles that have created emperors, warriors, and titans of industry throughout history, and once you understand how they work in your modern life, you'll never struggle with procrastination, weakness, or self-sabotage again. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment from which part of the world you're watching, because now I'm going to tell you everything. Have you ever noticed how we wake up worried about things we can't change? The traffic we'll face on our commute, our boss's reaction to that presentation, even the weather for the day. It's almost like our minds are programmed to focus on exactly what we can't influence, while neglecting what we actually can control. This morning, millions of people woke up and immediately reached for their phones, checking emails they can't respond to yet, scrolling through news that will only upset them, or looking at social media posts that trigger comparison and anxiety. Before even getting out of bed, they've already spent precious mental energy on things entirely outside their control, and we wonder why we feel exhausted before the day even begins. What's fascinating is that this isn't just a modern problem. 2,000 years ago, Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world at the time, wrote in his private journal, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, 'I have to go to work as a human being.'" Even as Emperor of Rome, controlling territories spanning 3 continents, he struggled with the same fundamental human challenge we all face, distinguishing between what we can and cannot control. This epidemic of misplaced mental energy is perhaps the most universal struggle we all share. Studies suggest we spend up to 80% of our mental resources worrying about, planning around, and reacting to circumstances we cannot change. Think about that for a moment. 4/5 of your mental capacity directed at things you have absolutely no power over. Let me ask you to do something right now, wherever you are. Pause for just 10 seconds and list 3 things currently occupying space in your mind. Just the first 3 concerns or thoughts that come up. Now, of those 3 things, how many are actually within your direct control? If you're like most people, at least 2 of them involve circumstances, other people's actions, or future events that you cannot directly influence. This is what the Stoics called the fundamental dichotomy of control, the essential dividing line between what belongs to us and what belongs to the world. And mastering this distinction is the first and most transformative step toward a life of inner peace. The technique is beautifully simple. Take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle. On the left side, write, "Not in my control." On the right, "In my control." Then, whenever you feel overwhelmed, anxious, or frustrated, list your concerns and place each one on the appropriate side of the line. Let's try this with some common examples. Your partner's mood, not in your control. How you respond to their mood, entirely in your control. The deadline your boss just moved up, not in your control. How you organize your time to meet it, in your control. The diagnosis you just received, not in your control. How you approach your treatment and care for yourself during it, in your control. This exercise sounds simple, almost too simple, but its power comes from the immediate clarity it creates in your mind. Our suffering rarely comes from the events themselves, but from the blurring of these boundaries, from expending energy trying to control the uncontrollable. I worked with someone recently who was going through an unexpected layoff. When we first spoke, she was consumed with questions like, "Why me?" and "How could they do this after 5 years?" She was losing sleep analyzing her former manager's decisions and company politics, all things completely outside her influence. After practicing the dichotomy of control, she refocused her energy entirely on what she could influence, updating her resume, reaching out to her network, developing new skills, and most importantly, how she was interpreting this event in her life story. Within weeks, her anxiety had decreased dramatically, and within 2 months, she had found a position she now describes as what I should have been doing all along. What changed wasn't her circumstance. She was still unemployed for those 2 months. What changed was where she directed her mental energy. There's fascinating neuroscience behind why this works so effectively. When we worry about things we can't control, our brains activate the amygdala, the threat detection center, triggering stress hormones that keep us in a state of high alert. This stress response consumes enormous cognitive resources, leaving us with less mental energy for problem-solving, creativity, and rational decision-making, exactly the faculties we need most when facing challenges. Think of your mind as a smartphone with limited battery life. Most people drain their mental battery on apps they can't control. Constantly refreshing the weather app won't change the forecast, just as constantly worrying about other people's opinions won't change their minds. Disciplined individuals preserve their battery for the apps that actually move their life forward. Let's practice this right now with a brief breathing exercise that can help you return to your circle of control whenever you feel overwhelmed. Take 3 deep breaths. On the first inhale, silently say, I notice my concerns. On the exhale, I release what I cannot control. On the second inhale, I focus on. And on the exhale, what I can influence. On the third inhale, my power lies. And on the exhale, in my choices right now. This 30-second practice can be used anywhere, before difficult conversations, during stressful meetings, or whenever you feel your attention being pulled toward the uncontrollable. The true power of the dichotomy of control reveals itself in the small daily irritations that so often derail our peace of mind. The driver who cuts you off in traffic, the email that goes unanswered, the appointment that runs late. In each of these moments, we have a choice: to exhaust ourselves fighting against reality or to direct our energy toward our response. I challenge you to try this for 24 hours. Classify every concern that arises as either within your control or outside it. My students who commit to this practice discover something remarkable. Nearly 90% of their daily worries involve things they cannot directly influence. Imagine reclaiming that 90% of mental energy and redirecting it toward what actually matters. To be clear, this doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent to the world around you. In fact, the opposite is true. By clearly distinguishing what you can control from what you can't, you become far more effective at influencing what's actually within your power. You stop wasting energy on the unchangeable and become remarkably powerful within your sphere of influence. Marcus Aurelius put it perfectly. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The dichotomy of control also transforms how we approach relationships. We often suffer because we try to control what others think, feel, or do. But the Stoics recognized that the only aspect of relationships within our control is our own contribution, our words, actions, and interpretations. A business leader I worked with was constantly frustrated by his team's performance. During our sessions, it became clear he was expending enormous energy trying to control their motivation and work styles. Once he applied the dichotomy of control, he shifted his focus entirely to what he could influence, how clearly he communicated expectations, the systems he created to support their work, and most importantly, his own interpretation of their performance. Not only did his stress decrease dramatically, but his team's performance actually improved once they no longer felt his anxious attempt to control their every move. The Stoic promise isn't that you'll never worry again. It's that you'll know exactly where to direct your energy when you do. You'll stop exhausting yourself trying to change the unchangeable and become remarkably effective at influencing what actually belongs to you. The ancient Stoics developed this practice not as philosophical theory, but as practical medicine for the soul. They understood that most human suffering comes from this fundamental confusion, trying to control the external world while neglecting our internal response to it. In their view, true freedom comes not from controlling circumstances, but from controlling our relationship to those circumstances. This first Stoic practice creates the foundation for everything else we'll explore. Without clarity about what belongs to you and what belongs to the universe, all other efforts at personal growth will be compromised by misplaced energy and attention. Now, I want you to consider one area of your life where you feel stuck or frustrated. What aspects of this situation have you been trying to control that actually belong outside your circle of influence? What aspects within your control have you been neglecting? Simply bringing awareness to this distinction can create an immediate shift in how you approach the challenge. Remember, this practice isn't about resignation, it's about recognition. Recognizing the boundaries of your influence doesn't limit your power. It concentrates it exactly where it can be most effective. As Epictetus, who was born a slave but became one of history's greatest teachers, said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." Now that you know how to distinguish what's under your control, we need to talk about something that seems to contradict all of this. The Stoics dedicated time every day deliberately imagining the worst possible scenarios. This practice, called premeditation of evils, wasn't pessimism. It was the most powerful technique for conquering fear and developing emotional resilience. Let's discover how it works. You know that feeling when you can't sleep because your mind is racing through all the things that might go wrong tomorrow? That presentation where you might forget your points, the difficult conversation that could turn into an argument, or the medical test results you're waiting for. What if I told you that this same mental habit, imagining negative scenarios, could become your greatest source of strength rather than your nightly torment? This is the fascinating paradox at the heart of one of the most powerful Stoic practices. Deliberately imagining the worst things that could happen isn't pessimism. It's preparation that creates unshakable peace of mind. When most people think of ancient philosophers, they imagine serene figures detached from worldly concerns. But Seneca, one of Rome's greatest Stoic teachers, and at one point the wealthiest man in the empire, practiced something that would seem bizarre to modern self-help enthusiasts. He regularly visualized losing everything he had. "Set aside a certain number of days," Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius, "during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with rough and coarse clothing, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" Seneca would deliberately practice living as if he had lost his wealth, his position, even his reputation, not because he was morbidly pessimistic, but because he understood a profound psychological truth. What we fear and avoid thinking about gains power over us, while what we willingly confront loses its ability to disturb our peace. But there's a crucial difference between what Seneca practiced and what many of us do at 3 in the morning when we can't sleep. The difference is between random, uncontrolled anxiety and intentional, structured premeditation. Let's try this right now with something that's been worrying you. Choose an upcoming event or situation that's causing you some anxiety. Perhaps a difficult conversation, an important presentation, or a challenging decision you need to make. Got it? Good. Now we're going to practice together. The effective premeditation of adversity follows 3 specific steps. First, visualize the negative scenario in detail. Second, accept it as a genuine possibility. Third, prepare your response. Let's start with visualization. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this situation unfolding in the worst yet realistic way. If it's a presentation, Imagine forgetting your points or facing difficult questions. If it's a conversation, imagine the other person becoming defensive or dismissive. Don't catastrophize with unrealistic disasters, just the genuinely challenging outcomes. Now for the acceptance phase. Say to yourself, this could happen. It's not certain, but it's possible, and if it does happen, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Feel the shift that happens when you stop resisting the possibility and simply acknowledge it. Finally, preparation. Ask yourself, if this happens, what specifically would I do? Not how you would feel, but what actions you would take. If you forget your presentation points, what's your recovery plan? If the conversation goes poorly, what would be your next steps? Did you notice what just happened? The scenario that was a vague, anxiety-producing cloud has been transformed into something concrete that you can prepare for. The fog of fear becomes the clarity of preparation. Modern neuroscience has validated what the Stoics discovered through observation. When we avoid thinking about potential difficulties, our amygdala, the brain's alarm system, remains on high alert, creating background anxiety. But when we deliberately process potential challenges, we activate the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for planning and rational thought. A 2016 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that decision fatigue, not physical exertion, is what depletes willpower. When you preemptively make decisions about potential challenges, you conserve mental energy for what truly matters. This is why Seneca wasn't just being dramatic when he practiced temporary poverty or imagined exile. He was literally rewiring his brain's response to adversity. But premeditation isn't just for major life challenges. It's perhaps even more valuable for the daily disruptions that derail our peace of mind. Consider the difference between two professionals facing an unexpected deadline. The first, caught unprepared, experiences a rush of stress hormones, making hasty decisions and working inefficiently as panic narrows their thinking. The second, having already mentally rehearsed this scenario during their morning premeditation, calmly activates their contingency plan without the emotional turbulence that clouds judgment. I worked with a physician who struggled with anxiety about potential emergencies disrupting his schedule. Every time his phone rang, his heart would race, anticipating a crisis that would derail his carefully planned day. After implementing a daily 2-minute premeditation practice where he visualized receiving emergency calls and mentally rehearsed his response, something remarkable happened. When actual emergencies occurred, they no longer triggered the same stress response. "I've already thought through this," he told me. "My mind doesn't panic because it recognizes the scenario and already has a plan." This is why I recommend making the morning premeditatio a daily practice. Before checking any devices, spend 3 minutes visualizing potential challenges in your day and mentally rehearsing your response. This creates a psychological vaccine against the very disruptions that normally derail discipline and peace of mind. The practice is simple. Sit quietly, take 3 deep breaths, and ask yourself, what might go wrong today? Then visualize 1 to 3 realistic challenges you might face. For each one, see it clearly, accept it as a possibility, and decide specifically how you would respond. This isn't about dwelling on negativity, quite the opposite. It's about creating the mental freedom that comes from being prepared for reality rather than hoping for an idealized day without challenges. A misconception about Stoicism is that it promotes emotional detachment or pessimism. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Stoics were deeply engaged with life and remarkably optimistic about human potential. They simply understood that pretending difficulties won't arise is a form of self-deception that creates anxiety, while preparing for them creates genuine confidence. As Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, 'The people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly.'" This wasn't because he was a misanthrope, but because he knew that expecting everyone to be reasonable, grateful, and kind was setting himself up for frustration. By anticipating difficult people and situations, he freed himself to respond virtuously rather than reactively. Let's expand this practice beyond just morning preparation. Premeditation can be especially powerful when applied to specific situations that typically trigger anxiety. If public speaking terrifies you, try this exercise. For 5 minutes, vividly imagine yourself forgetting your words, facing a hostile question, or having technical difficulties. For each scenario, develop a specific response plan. Then practice saying to yourself, "Even if this happens, I can handle it. I have a plan." The paradoxical effect of this practice is that by willingly facing your fears in imagination, you dramatically reduce their power over you in reality. The very act of saying, "I can handle this specific difficulty," creates neural pathways of resilience that your brain can access when needed. One of my students who struggled with social anxiety used premeditation before attending networking events. Instead of vaguely dreading awkward interactions, she specifically imagined walking into a room where she knew no one, not knowing what to say, or being briefly ignored. By visualizing these scenarios and planning specific responses, she transformed her experience from one of generalized dread to focused preparation. The amazing thing, she told me later, is that when those awkward moments actually happened, I almost welcomed them because I'd already prepared for them. They became opportunities to implement my plan rather than threats to avoid. A common mistake with premeditation is confusing it with negative rumination. The key difference is in the framework and outcome. Negative rumination is uncontrolled, repetitive, and ends with greater anxiety. Premeditation is structured, solution-focused, and ends with greater confidence. You can hear this difference in the language. Negative rumination sounds like, "What if this happens? I would be devastated. Everything would fall apart." Effective premeditation sounds like, "If this happens, then I will respond by doing this specific thing. I have the capacity to handle this challenge." This shift in language represents a fundamental shift in your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of being at the mercy of what might happen, you become the author of your response regardless of what happens. The Stoics recommended practicing premeditation not just for anticipated challenges, but also for life's biggest uncertainties. Seneca advised regularly contemplating the loss of loved ones, not to diminish joy in their presence, but to deepen appreciation while preparing for life's inevitable losses. "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a living man," Seneca wrote, understanding that our fear of contemplating difficult truths often prevents us from living fully. For those who find this practice initially uncomfortable, start small. Begin with minor daily inconveniences, traffic delays, technology glitches, or small interpersonal tensions before working up to larger concerns. The goal isn't to dwell on negativity, but to develop the psychological muscle of preparedness. Try incorporating this practice into your daily routine. The morning is ideal, as it sets a foundation of readiness for the day ahead, but any consistent time works. Some people find it helpful to combine premeditation with their evening planning, identifying tomorrow's potential challenges alongside their scheduled commitments. Remember, this practice isn't about expecting the worst in a pessimistic sense. It's about being prepared for reality in all its complexity. The Stoics were fundamentally optimistic about human capacity to respond virtuously to any circumstance, but they knew this capacity is strengthened through deliberate practice rather than wishful thinking. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This practice connects powerfully with the dichotomy of control we explored earlier. Premeditation helps us focus specifically on what we can control, our responses, while acknowledging what we can't control, the circumstances we might face. Together, these two practices create a formidable foundation for inner peace, regardless of external events. The premeditation of potential difficulties prepares your mind, but for true transformation, we need the element that was missing in all previous philosophies: consistent action. Epictetus, who was born a slave and became one of Rome's greatest teachers, insisted that philosophy without practice is mere entertainment. In the next chapter, we'll discover how he transformed abstract principles into concrete daily habits that anyone can implement immediately. This powerful distinction between what you can and cannot control is just the first step toward genuine transformation. But even with this clarity, there's still an enormous gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. Have you ever found yourself nodding along to great advice, feeling inspired to change, only to wake up the next day and fall right back into old patterns? This gap between knowledge and action is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of personal growth. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave before becoming one of Rome's greatest teachers, addressed this problem directly. "Don't explain your philosophy," he told his students. "Embody it." He understood something profound that modern self-help often misses. Philosophy without practice is merely entertainment. Knowledge without action is just intellectual decoration. If you didn't learn these things in order to demonstrate them in practice, Epictetus would challenge his students, what did you learn them for? This question cuts straight to the heart of our modern predicament. We consume endless books, podcasts, and videos about improving our lives, yet often struggle to implement even the simplest practices consistently. This is our modern dilemma. We are rich in knowledge, but poor in implementation. We know what we should do: exercise regularly, eat nutritiously, manage our emotions, be present with loved ones. Yet we struggle to translate this knowledge into consistent action. The problem isn't information, it's integration. The reason most people fail at discipline isn't a lack of motivation or willpower. It's that they're attempting change in a way that works against human nature rather than with it. They try to transform their lives through heroic efforts and grand commitments that inevitably collapse under their own weight. Epictetus took a radically different approach. Having observed humans at all levels of society, from slaves to emperors, he recognized that sustainable change never comes from dramatic transformations. "No great thing is created suddenly," he taught, "any more than a bunch of grapes or a fig. If you tell me that you desire a fig, I answer that there must be time. Let it first blossom, then bear fruit, then ripen." This insight is revolutionary. True discipline isn't about dramatic change, but about small, consistent actions that accumulate over time. The Stoics didn't believe in overnight transformation. They understood that lasting change requires patience and incremental progress. Let's put this into practice right now. Think of one change you've been wanting to make in your life, perhaps developing a meditation practice, writing regularly, or exercising consistently. Now, instead of committing to some ambitious goal, meditate for 30 minutes daily, write for 2 hours, exercise for an hour, I want you to reduce it to the smallest possible step. What's the minimum viable action you could take that would move you in the right direction? For meditation, it might be sitting for just 1 minute. For writing, opening your document and writing a single sentence. For exercise, doing a single push-up or taking a 5-minute walk. These micro-commitments might seem trivially small. That's exactly the point. They're so small that the usual resistance doesn't activate. Your brain doesn't have time to generate excuses. I call this approach micro-commitment architecture, inspired by Epictetus's teaching that we should make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Instead of trying to force massive change through willpower, which inevitably fails, we design our commitments to be so small that they bypass our resistance entirely. This approach aligns perfectly with modern behavioral science. Research by B.J. Fogg at Stanford University shows that tiny behaviors, when consistently triggered, create sustainable habits far more effectively than ambitious commitments. The key insight is that discipline fails primarily at the starting point. Once you begin an activity, continuing is relatively easy. By making the initiation trivially small, you bypass the brain's resistance mechanisms. I'll admit, when I first encountered this idea, it seemed too simple to be effective. How could committing to just one push-up or writing just one sentence create real discipline? But after implementing it myself, I discovered its power isn't in the initial action. It's in how it bypasses the brain's resistance to beginning. A student of mine who struggled with meditation for years finally established a consistent practice using this method. "I stopped forcing myself to meditate for 20 minutes," she explained. "I just committed to sitting down and taking 3 breaths. Once I was there, continuing was easy. Some days I still only do 3 breaths, but most days I naturally continue for 10 or 15 minutes. The miracle isn't how long I meditate, it's that I actually do it every day now." The science behind this approach is fascinating. When we try to make significant changes, we activate the brain's threat detection system. The amygdala, our primitive alarm system, perceives major disruptions to routine as potential threats and generates resistance to protect us. But tiny commitments fly under this radar. They don't trigger the threat response, allowing us to establish new patterns without fighting our own biology. Let's integrate this with what we've already learned about the dichotomy of control. The size of your commitment is entirely within your control, while your feelings of motivation or resistance often aren't. By focusing on what you can control, making your commitment appropriately small, you set yourself up for success regardless of how you feel on any given day. Here's how to implement micro-commitment architecture in your life. First, identify a change you want to make. Be specific about what success would look like. Second, reduce that change to the smallest possible action that moves you in the right direction. It should feel ridiculously easy, something you could do even on your worst day. Third, identify a specific trigger for this action, something you already do every day that can serve as a cue. After I brush my teeth, I will do 1 push-up. After I pour my morning coffee, I will write 1 sentence. Fourth, celebrate completing this tiny action. This sounds silly, but it's crucial. A small surge of positive emotion helps wire the new habit into your brain. A software engineer I worked with had tried and failed to learn a new programming language for years. Using this technique, he committed to just 5 minutes daily. Within 3 months, he had built a functional application, not because 5 minutes is a lot of time, but because he actually showed up consistently for the first time. What surprised me most, he told me, wasn't that I learned the language. It was how easy it became to sit down and work on it. What started as a forced 5 minutes often extended to an hour because once I started, the resistance disappeared. But if I had initially committed to an hour, I would have never begun. This approach works because it acknowledges a fundamental truth about human nature. Starting is harder than continuing. By making the start trivially easy, you overcome the greatest barrier to consistent action. Now, let's take this principle beyond individual habits and apply it to our entire relationship with discipline. The Stoics didn't just practice discipline, they reflected on it. They understood that awareness must precede change. This brings us to another powerful Stoic practice, the value-time alignment audit. The Stoics believed that living virtuously meant living in accordance with nature, both universal nature and your own personal nature as expressed through your deepest values. Here's how it works. At the end of each week, review your calendar and make an honest assessment. If you claim to value health but spent 0 hours exercising, or claimed to value family but worked through every evening. This practice forces you to confront the gap between your stated values and your lived reality. One business executive I worked with discovered through this practice that while he claimed to value creative work above all, he was spending 70% of his time in reactive communication. This simple awareness allowed him to restructure his calendar to protect his most valuable creation time. Neurologically, this practice activates the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for detecting contradictions. When you consciously register the disconnect between values and actions, your brain naturally seeks resolution, making discipline less about forcing yourself and more about resolving cognitive dissonance. This audit isn't about shame or self-criticism. It's about awareness. The Stoics understood that most people live unconsciously, allowing external demands to dictate their time while their deepest values remain neglected. By bringing conscious attention to this gap, you create the necessary tension that motivates authentic change. Try this simplified version right now. Write down your 3 most important values. Then estimate what percentage of your time last week was aligned with each value. Be honest. This exercise is for you alone. Notice any gap between what you say matters and how you actually spend your limited time. This awareness creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling that arises when our actions contradict our beliefs. Rather than trying to suppress this discomfort, the Stoics used it as a powerful motivator for realignment. Another practical tool for building discipline is what I call discipline triggering, strategically placing physical reminders in your environment that prompt specific behaviors. Marcus Aurelius kept his philosophical principles close at hand, not because he had memorized them perfectly, but because he needed constant reminders. A writer I know struggled with consistent production until she created a simple trigger, a special candle she lights only when writing. Now, the physical act of lighting the candle signals to her brain that it's time to focus. She doesn't have to fight for discipline. The trigger creates the mental state she needs. This might sound like simple habit building, but there's a crucial Stoic element. Each trigger is connected not just to a behavior, but to a virtue or value. When you create a trigger, define not just what you'll do, but who you'll be in that moment. For example, rather than just setting an alarm to exercise, create a trigger that reminds you of your commitment to self-respect and integrity. This might be a specific phrase you say, an object you touch, or an image you look at. The physical trigger connects the behavior to your deeper values, making discipline about character rather than just checking boxes. Take a moment now to identify one area where your discipline consistently fails. What physical trigger could you create to initiate the behavior you want? It could be as simple as placing your running shoes by the door, setting a special tone for your focus time, or creating a dedicated space for your priority work. All these practices culminate in what might be the most powerful Stoic discipline practice of all, the evening reflection. Unlike modern approaches that focus on achievements, the Stoic evening reflection asks 3 specific questions. What did I do well today? Where did I fall short? How will I improve tomorrow? This practice functions as a daily course correction, preventing small deviations from becoming major departures from your path. A study from Harvard Business School found that employees who spent 15 minutes at the end of their day reflecting on lessons learned performed 23% better after 10 days than those who didn't reflect. I used to think I didn't have time for daily reflection. My schedule was already packed. How could I justify 15 minutes of just thinking? But after implementing this practice, I discovered it actually created time by eliminating repeated mistakes and improving decision quality. The evening reflection isn't about judging yourself harshly. It's about creating a feedback loop for continuous improvement. As Seneca wrote, "I will keep constant watch over myself and, most usefully, will review my day. When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. This honest self-examination creates the awareness necessary for genuine growth. Without it, we often repeat the same patterns day after day, wondering why nothing changes. These Stoic practices, micro-commitment architecture, value-time alignment, discipline triggering, and evening reflection, create a comprehensive system for building discipline not through force or deprivation, but through alignment, awareness, and small, consistent actions. They don't require extraordinary willpower. They're designed to work with your existing nature, gradually transforming difficulty into ease. As you implement these practices, remember that discipline in the Stoic sense isn't about rigid control or perfection. It's about consistent action aligned with your deepest values. The goal isn't to become superhuman, but to become fully human, to live with integrity and purpose. These first 6 practices create the foundation of Stoic discipline, not through force or deprivation, but through alignment, awareness, and small, consistent actions. They don't require extraordinary willpower. They're designed to work with your existing nature, gradually transforming difficulty into ease. But knowing how to transform negative scenarios into opportunities is only part of the equation. What about when things are going well? The Stoics knew that without a specific practice, no amount of success brings contentment. Seneca, even being one of the richest men in Rome, realized that without a daily exercise, our minds naturally focus on what's lacking rather than what we have. Imagine that we're sitting in traffic together. The car in front of you suddenly cuts you off, nearly causing an accident. What happens in the split second before you react? Your heart races, your muscles tense, and a thought flashes through your mind. What an inconsiderate jerk. But here's the crucial question. Was it the car cutting you off that created your anger? Or was it your interpretation of what just happened? This distinction between events and our judgments about them is perhaps the most revolutionary insight the Stoics offered the world. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the most powerful empire on earth, wrote in his private journal, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment." Think about that for a second. The Emperor of Rome, facing rebellions, plagues, and betrayals, discovered that his suffering came not from these external challenges, but from his judgments about them. And if this was true for someone dealing with literal life and death decisions affecting millions, how much more might it apply to our daily frustrations with traffic, unanswered emails, or social media comments? Modern psychology has spent decades catching up to what the Stoics intuited 2,000 years ago. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective therapeutic approaches today, is essentially built on this Stoic foundation. The recognition that our thoughts about events, not the events themselves, determine our emotional responses. Let's break this down into what I call the 3 levels of perception. First, there's the raw event, the car cutting you off, the email that went unanswered, the comment your colleague made in a meeting. This level is neutral, just facts without interpretation. The second level is your automatic interpretation, the instant judgment your mind makes without conscious choice. That driver is a jerk. My boss is ignoring me. My colleague was trying to undermine me. The third level, and this is where freedom lies, is your chosen interpretation. This is where you can pause, question your automatic judgment, and choose a different perspective. Try this exercise right now. Think of something that annoyed or upset you today. First, strip it down to the raw event, just the facts without any interpretation. Now, notice the automatic judgment your mind attached to it. Finally, ask yourself, is there another way I could interpret this same situation? For example, let's say someone didn't respond to your important message. The event is simply, I sent a message at 9 in the morning and haven't received a reply by 5 in the afternoon. The automatic interpretation might be, they're ignoring me or they don't respect my time. But a chosen interpretation could be, they might be dealing with something urgent, or even, this gives me more time to refine my own thoughts on the matter. Notice how different each interpretation feels in your body. The automatic judgments typically create tension, anger, or anxiety. The chosen interpretations usually allow for more ease and rational response. This practice of separating events from judgments is what I call the desaccoplamento technique, creating space between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, who was heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy, famously said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. The Stoics were masters at widening this space. But how do we actually create this space in the heat of the moment? The Stoics developed specific questions to interrupt automatic judgments. Is this really as important as it seems right now? Will this matter in a month, a year, 5 years? Am I certain my interpretation is the only possible one? What would I advise a friend in this same situation? These questions create a momentary pause that breaks the automatic link between event and reaction. Even a pause of a few seconds can be enough to choose a different interpretation. I worked with someone who was constantly frustrated by conflicts at work. In team meetings, he interpreted any questioning of his ideas as personal attacks. By practicing the desaccoplamento technique, he began to create space between the event, a colleague asking questions, and his interpretation, I'm being attacked. Over time, he developed the ability to choose different interpretations. Maybe they're trying to strengthen the idea, or this questioning helps us all think more clearly. Not only did his stress decrease dramatically, but his team relationships improved as people no longer had to walk on eggshells around him. The modern science on this is fascinating. When we react with automatic judgments, the amygdala, our brain's threat detection system, takes control, reducing blood flow to our prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational thinking. This literally makes us less intelligent in the moment. But when we create space through questioning, we keep our prefrontal cortex engaged, allowing for more thoughtful responses. Integrating this practice into your daily routine can be as simple as developing the habit of pausing for 10 seconds before responding to anything that triggers you. During those 10 seconds, ask yourself, what just happened? Facts only. And what am I telling myself about what happened? Interpretation. Another powerful way to develop this skill is through what I call the judgment journal. A simple practice of noting situations that triggered strong emotions and separating the events from your interpretations. At the end of each day, write down 2 or 3 incidents that caused stress or strong reactions. For each one, write what actually happened, just the facts, what I told myself about what happened, my interpretation, alternative interpretations that could also be true, how each interpretation makes me feel. One of the most transformative aspects of this practice is how it changes our relationship with our own thoughts. Most of us move through life completely identified with our interpretations, never questioning whether they're accurate or helpful. The Stoics recognize that many of our automatic judgments are not just inaccurate, but actively harmful to our well-being. For example, when you make a mistake at work, your automatic judgment might be, I'm incompetent. But is that really true? Or is it more accurate to say, I made an error in this specific situation, which I can learn from? The first interpretation creates shame and diminishes your ability to improve. The second acknowledges reality while maintaining your capacity to grow. This leads to another powerful Stoic technique, transforming your language from identity statements to experience statements. Instead of "I am anxious," try "I am experiencing anxiety right now." Instead of "I'm a failure," try "I failed at this specific task." This subtle shift creates space between you and your experiences. You are not your anxiety, your failure, or your success. You are the awareness that experiences these temporary states. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this constantly. When you are offended at any man's fault, turn to yourself and study your own failings. Then you will forget your anger. The practice of observing your thoughts without identifying with them has remarkable parallels with mindfulness meditation, which has been extensively studied by modern neuroscience. Regular practitioners show increased activity in the parts of the brain associated with self-observation and decreased activity in the default mode network, the region responsible for self-referential thinking and rumination. In essence, both Stoic practice and mindfulness develop what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thinking processes rather than being caught up in them. This awareness is like developing a new perspective, as if you could watch your thoughts from a slight distance rather than being completely immersed in them. A business leader I worked with described this shift. Before practicing this, I was my thoughts. If I thought this project is going to fail, I experienced the full stress of actual failure. Now I can notice I'm having the thought that this project might fail and respond thoughtfully instead of reactively. This doesn't mean suppressing or denying emotions. The Stoics weren't advocating for emotional repression, but for emotional intelligence, understanding the role our judgments play in creating our emotional experiences. As Epictetus taught, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Let's practice this right now with a common situation. Imagine you send an important proposal to a client and days pass without a response. Notice your automatic interpretation. Perhaps it's, "They didn't like my work," or "They're going with someone else." Now create space by questioning, "Do I know this for certain? What other explanations could there be? How important will this seem a month from now?" Feel how this questioning changes your emotional response and opens up more possibilities for action. Instead of anxiously waiting or sending a desperate follow-up, you might calmly check in with a helpful, no-pressure message. This practice of questioning judgments becomes particularly powerful when applied to our judgments about ourselves. Many of us carry harsh inner critics that constantly judge our performance, appearance, and worth. The Stoics understood that these self-judgments can be the most limiting of all. Epictetus, who began life as a slave and became one of Rome's greatest teachers, often reminded his students, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things." This applied especially to judgments about ourselves. When we judge ourselves harshly for normal human mistakes or limitations, we create unnecessary suffering and undermine our ability to improve. Try bringing awareness to your self-judgments for just one day. Notice when your inner voice says things like, "I should be better at this by now," or "What's wrong with me?" These are judgments, not facts, and recognizing them as such is the first step toward freedom from their power. The ultimate goal of this practice isn't to eliminate all judgments. That would be impossible for a human mind. Rather, the goal is to become aware of judgments as they arise, question those that create unnecessary suffering, and consciously choose interpretations that align with reality and support your well-being. As you develop this skill, you'll notice something remarkable. Events that once triggered immediate stress or anxiety now present themselves as opportunities for choice. The gap between stimulus and response widens, and within that gap, you discover new freedom. This doesn't mean you'll never feel negative emotions. The Stoics weren't trying to eliminate emotions, but to engage with them intelligently. They understood that emotions provide valuable information when we can separate them from our automatic judgments. For example, Feeling fear when walking alone at night might be providing useful information about potential danger. But feeling fear about speaking up in a meeting is likely based on judgments about potential social rejection that may not be accurate. With practice, this ability to question judgments becomes second nature. You'll find yourself automatically creating space between events and interpretations, especially in challenging situations. What once felt like inevitable reactions now feels like conscious choices. When you can observe your judgments rather than being trapped in them, you gain what the Stoics considered true freedom. Not freedom from external circumstances, but freedom in how you respond to them. Now that you can observe your judgments, let's explore how to deliberately direct your attention. The Stoics knew that our mind has another troublesome tendency, focusing on what's missing, what went wrong, what could be better. Seneca, even as one of the wealthiest men in Rome, realized that without a specific practice, no amount of success brings contentment. He developed a daily exercise that modern neuroscience has discovered to be the most powerful for transforming our well-being. Let's explore it now. The ability to question our judgments gives us tremendous freedom, but the Stoics recognized another fundamental challenge we all face. Our minds naturally focus on what's missing rather than what we have. Have you ever achieved something you desperately wanted? A promotion, a relationship, a possession, only to find that the satisfaction lasted briefly before you started wanting something else? This isn't just your personal failing, it's built into our cognitive architecture. Think about your day so far. What stood out? The things that went smoothly or the minor annoyances? For most of us, our attention gravitates toward problems, lacks, and dissatisfactions. We take for granted the incredible gifts surrounding us, from basic necessities like clean water and shelter to the miracle of being alive at all. This isn't because we're ungrateful people. It's because our brains evolved to scan for threats and deficiencies, not to appreciate abundance. This is what psychologists call the negativity bias, our tendency to register negative stimuli more readily than positive ones. It was useful for survival on the savannah, but in our modern lives, it creates a persistent sense of dissatisfaction that no amount of external success can resolve. Seneca, who was at one point the wealthiest man in Rome, understood this paradox intimately. Despite his vast fortune, he noticed how easily he became fixated on what he didn't have. His solution was radical. He regularly practiced voluntary poverty. "Set aside a certain number of days," he wrote to his friend Lucilius, "during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with rough and coarse clothing, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" This wasn't some masochistic exercise. Seneca recognized that our fear of losing what we have creates constant anxiety, while our failure to appreciate what we have creates constant dissatisfaction. His practice addressed both problems simultaneously. But there's a crucial distinction we need to make here. What Seneca practiced wasn't just passive gratitude, it was active contentment. Modern gratitude practices often involve listing things we're thankful for. This is valuable, but the Stoic practice goes deeper. It involves actively recognizing that what you have is enough, that you could lose much of what you possess and still live a good life. Let's try an exercise right now that will make this distinction clear. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that tomorrow you'll lose access to running water for 3 days. Visualize in detail what your life would be like, how you would adapt, what would be challenging, what simple pleasures you would miss. Now open your eyes and notice how differently you perceive your access to water. That shift in perception, from taking something for granted to truly valuing it, is the essence of the Stoic gratitude practice. This approach functions at 3 distinct levels. The first is recognition, simply noticing what you have. The second is appreciation, genuinely valuing these things rather than seeing them as entitlements. The third and deepest level is non-attachment, recognizing that while you value what you have, your well-being doesn't depend on it. Modern neuroscience has validated what the Stoics discovered through observation. A consistent gratitude practice literally rewires your brain, increasing activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with learning and decision-making. One study from the University of California found that people who practiced gratitude for 3 weeks showed lasting changes in brain activity visible on MRI scans, with increased neural sensitivity to gratitude experiences even months after the practice ended. But how do we translate this understanding into daily life? The key is transforming routine activities into opportunities for contentment. As you drive to work, instead of focusing on traffic, you might appreciate the engineering marvel that is your vehicle, the infrastructure that allows smooth travel, or simply the ability to move freely from place to place, something many throughout history couldn't take for granted. As you eat a meal, rather than scrolling through your phone, you might focus on the complex journey that brought this food to your plate. The farmers, transporters, store workers, and countless others whose efforts make your nourishment possible. Even challenging tasks can become opportunities for contentment. When you're completing paperwork, instead of focusing on the tedium, you might appreciate the systems that allow society to function, or simply the fact that you have the literacy and cognitive ability to complete the task. I worked with someone who was going through serious health challenges. Instead of focusing exclusively on their limitations, they began a daily practice of noting the parts of their body that were functioning well. I can still see beautiful things. I can still taste delicious food. I can still hear music that moves me. This wasn't toxic positivity or denial of their real challenges. It was choosing to widen their attention to include what was still working alongside what wasn't. This practice transformed their experience not by changing their circumstances, but by changing their relationship to those circumstances. As Epictetus taught, it is not what happens to you, but how you respond to what happens to you that matters. The Stoics formalized this approach in an evening ritual that remains one of the most powerful practices for developing contentment. At the end of each day, Epictetus advised his students to review not just their mistakes, as we discussed in the previous chapter, but also their blessings. This practice is deceptively simple. Before sleep, take 3 minutes to ask yourself, what went well today? What do I have that I often take for granted? What difficulties did I face that actually contain hidden benefits? That last question is particularly powerful. The Stoics were masters at finding value in difficulty. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This perspective transforms obstacles from things to avoid into opportunities for growth. For example, that difficult conversation you've been dreading becomes an opportunity to practice courage and clarity. The unexpected expense becomes a chance to practice resourcefulness. The criticism from a colleague becomes valuable feedback for improvement. This doesn't mean pretending difficulties are pleasant. It means recognizing that difficulties often contain precisely the conditions needed for developing virtue and wisdom. But what about when we're facing significant challenges that seem to have no redeeming qualities? The Stoic practice of contentment works even, perhaps especially, in the midst of hardship. This is because the practice isn't about pretending everything is perfect. It's about recognizing that external circumstances don't determine your capacity for virtuous action and inner peace. When Viktor Frankl, whose work was deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, found himself in a concentration camp, he discovered this truth in the most extreme conditions. "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing," he wrote, "the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." This is the ultimate Stoic insight about contentment. It's always available because it doesn't depend on circumstances being ideal. It depends on your capacity to find meaning and purpose regardless of external conditions. As you develop this practice, you'll notice something remarkable. The things you once thought essential for happiness begin to lose their grip on you. This doesn't mean you no longer enjoy pleasures or pursue goals. It means you're no longer dependent on specific outcomes for your sense of well-being. This leads to another crucial distinction in the Stoic approach to contentment: separating appreciation from attachment. You can fully value something without making your happiness contingent on it. You can enjoy a delicious meal without being devastated if tomorrow's meal is simple. You can love someone deeply without making your sense of self depend on their approval. Epictetus expressed this beautifully. With regard to whatever objects give you delight, are useful, or are deeply loved, remember to tell yourself of what general nature they are, beginning from the most insignificant things. If, for example, you are fond of a specific ceramic cup, remind yourself that it is only ceramic cups in general of which you are fond. Then if it breaks, you will not be disturbed. This isn't emotional detachment, it's emotional freedom. The difference is subtle but profound. Detachment implies not caring. Freedom implies caring deeply, but not being controlled by that caring. This freedom transforms relationships as well. When we practice contentment with the people in our lives, appreciating who they are without trying to change them, we create space for authentic connection. Our relationships become less transactional. You make me happy when you do what I want, and more appreciative. I value who you are, even when we disagree. A simple way to integrate this practice into your interactions is to begin conversations by mentally noting one thing you appreciate about the person you're speaking with. This subtle shift in attention changes the entire quality of the interaction. For those who find this practice challenging, I recommend starting with a simple 2-minute daily ritual. At the same time each day, perhaps with your morning coffee or as you commute home, ask yourself, what am I taking for granted right now that, if lost, I would desperately miss? This question bypasses the intellectual exercise of, I should be grateful for X, and connects you directly to genuine appreciation. Over time, this practice doesn't just change your perspective, it changes your default mode of perception. You begin to automatically notice what's working, what's available, what's going well. This doesn't mean ignoring problems that need addressing. It means engaging with those problems from a foundation of sufficiency rather than scarcity. As Seneca wrote, "He who is not content with what he has would not be content with what he would like to have." This insight cuts to the heart of our modern consumption-driven unhappiness. We chase new experiences, possessions, and achievements, believing they'll finally make us content, not realizing that contentment is a skill to be practiced rather than a destination to be reached. The Stoics understood something that modern science has now confirmed: hedonic adaptation. Our tendency to quickly return to a baseline level of satisfaction, regardless of changes in our circumstances, is a powerful force. Studies show that both lottery winners and people who become paralyzed return to roughly their pre-event happiness levels within months. The implication is profound. If external circumstances don't determine our lasting happiness, we're free to focus on what the Stoics considered most important: developing virtue and wisdom through our choices and actions. This doesn't mean the Stoics advocated passive acceptance of everything. They were remarkably active in pursuing positive change both personally and socially. The difference was that their actions stemmed from sufficiency rather than lack, from choice rather than desperation. As you develop this practice of Stoic contentment, you'll discover a paradoxical truth. When you no longer need things to be different to be at peace, you become more effective at creating positive change. Your actions come from clarity rather than anxiety, from purpose rather than craving. The practice of contentment centers us in the present, but the Stoics also look toward the end. They contemplated their own mortality regularly, not out of morbid fascination, but because, as Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." In the next chapter, we'll discover how this practice, far from being depressing, actually intensifies our appreciation of life and clarifies our priorities in ways no other technique can. This practice of contentment helps us appreciate what we have. But the Stoics had another technique that seems dark at first glance, yet proves incredibly liberating. Imagine I asked you a strange question. If you knew you had exactly 1 year to live, what would you change about your life starting today? Take a moment to actually consider this. Would you spend your time differently? Would you have different conversations? Would you finally pursue that passion you've been postponing? Something interesting happens when we contemplate our mortality. Suddenly, the trivial concerns that consume our daily attention, the social media slight, the minor workplace politics, the status anxiety, fade into insignificance. What emerges instead is clarity about what truly matters. In our modern society, we've created an elaborate system of death denial. We use euphemisms, segregate the dying in hospitals, and avoid the topic in conversation. When was the last time you had an honest discussion about death that wasn't prompted by tragedy? This avoidance comes at a tremendous cost to our lives. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most powerful man in the ancient world as Emperor of Rome, didn't have the luxury of avoiding this reality. Leading armies and governing an empire that faced constant threats, he confronted mortality daily. In his private journal, he wrote to himself, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." This wasn't morbid pessimism. It was a practical reminder that transformed his priorities and actions. The distinction here is crucial. There's a world of difference between anxiety about death, the unconscious fear that underlies much of our avoidance, and intentional contemplation of mortality as a philosophical practice. One diminishes life, the other enhances it. Let's try a simple exercise right now that will demonstrate this difference. Imagine yourself on your deathbed, looking back on your life. From that perspective, what decision would you make differently today? Perhaps you'd finally have that difficult but necessary conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe you'd spend less time on trivial distractions and more on meaningful creation. Or perhaps you'd simply express love more freely to those who matter most. This perspective from the end of life creates what the Stoics considered clear seeing, the ability to distinguish what truly matters from what merely feels urgent in the moment. As Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." The Stoic practice of memento mori, remember that you will die, functions at 3 distinct levels. The first is simple recognition of finitude, acknowledging that your time is limited rather than proceeding as if you have endless tomorrows. The second is prioritization, using awareness of mortality to focus on what truly matters. The third is intensified appreciation, experiencing ordinary moments with greater presence and gratitude because you recognize their impermanence. Modern research confirms what the Stoics discovered through observation. A study published in the Psychological Science journal found that people who were prompted to think about death subsequently reported greater appreciation for life and stronger intentions to prioritize meaningful goals over trivial pursuits. Another study from the University of Missouri found that brief mortality contemplation increased people's generosity and compassion toward others. This happens because awareness of mortality activates the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, which helps resolve conflicts between competing priorities. When faced with limited time, the brain naturally prioritizes meaning over distraction, connection over acquisition, and legacy over momentary comfort. But how do we integrate this awareness into daily life without becoming morbid or anxious? The key is structured practice rather than random rumination. One powerful approach is what I call the mortality audit, a weekly 5-minute reflection where you review your calendar and choices through the lens of finitude. Ask yourself, if I knew I had 1 year to live, would I still have spent my time this way? Would these meetings, these activities, these pursuits still seem important? This isn't about dramatic life changes, though those might sometimes be warranted. It's about incremental realignment with what truly matters to you. I worked with someone who performed this audit consistently for a month. He discovered that nearly 40% of his calendar was filled with commitments that, from the perspective of limited time, held no real value for him. This clarity allowed him to gradually restructure his time around more meaningful pursuits, not by quitting his job or making radical changes, but by eliminating low-value activities and protecting space for what mattered most. The power of this practice lies in its ability to cut through the social conditioning that often drives our choices. We pursue certain careers, possessions, or achievements not because they align with our deepest values, but because they align with external expectations. Mortality awareness helps us distinguish between what we want and what we've been taught to want. As you implement this practice, you might notice resistance arising, discomfort, avoidance, or even fear. This is normal. Our culture doesn't equip us with healthy ways to contemplate mortality. But the Stoics would say this discomfort itself is valuable information, pointing to the very attachments and illusions that limit our freedom. Specific techniques can help overcome this resistance. Visualization exercises where you imagine your life ending peacefully after a complete life can reduce anxiety while maintaining the clarifying benefits. Writing exercises where you compose a hypothetical eulogy or legacy statement can reveal your true priorities. Even simple reminders like a small memento mori symbol, a coin, a special watch, or an image can serve as a daily prompt for perspective. The weekly ritual is particularly powerful. Reserve 5 minutes, perhaps on Sunday evening, for structured contemplation. Ask yourself, what would I regret not doing if my time were limited? What relationships would I wish I had nurtured? What contributions would I wish I had made? Then identify one small action you can take in the coming week to align more closely with these priorities. It's important to understand that this practice isn't about living with anxiety or morbid preoccupation. It's about living with greater intention and presence. As Seneca wrote, "The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time." When we live with awareness of mortality, we experience ordinary moments with extraordinary attention. This transformation extends beyond personal priorities to our relationships. When we recognize that our time with loved ones is finite, our interactions change quality. Petty conflicts lose their power. Meaningful conversations gain urgency. We become less likely to postpone expressions of love or gratitude. Think about someone important in your life. If you knew with certainty that you had limited time with them, would you interact differently? Would you listen more attentively? Would you express appreciation more freely? Would you prioritize their company over lesser commitments? The awareness of finitude doesn't diminish these relationships. It intensifies and purifies them. It strips away the illusion that we have endless time to resolve conflicts, express love, or create memories together. This perspective is especially transformative when applied to family relationships. Many of us maintain ongoing tensions with family members, assuming there will always be time to resolve them later. The mortality perspective asks, if you knew your time together was limited, would these tensions still seem important enough to maintain? One person I worked with had maintained distance from her father for years over a relatively minor conflict. After practicing mortality awareness for several weeks, she realized that her pride was less important than the relationship. Their reconciliation wasn't dramatic, Just a simple conversation that opened the door to a renewed connection. I realized I was acting as if we had unlimited time to resolve this, she told me. When I acknowledged we don't, my priorities shifted immediately. This shift in perspective affects not just who we spend time with, but how we spend that time. Many people discover that their device use changes dramatically with mortality awareness. The average person spends 3 hours daily on social media and nearly 7 hours on screens for entertainment. When viewed through the lens of finite time, these numbers often prompt re-evaluation. I'm not suggesting elimination of leisure or entertainment. The Stoics valued proper rest and recreation, but they distinguished between refreshing leisure and numbing distraction. The question becomes, is this activity restoring me so I can return to meaningful living, or is it a way of avoiding life altogether? As this practice deepens, you may notice another remarkable shift. Your fear of death itself may diminish. This seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't thinking about death increase fear? But the Stoics found the opposite. By contemplating mortality regularly in a philosophical context, death becomes less a shadowy terror and more a natural fact to be accepted. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but rather he should fear never beginning to live." The real tragedy, from the Stoic perspective, isn't death after a well-lived life. It's reaching the end without having truly lived at all. This acceptance doesn't happen overnight. It develops gradually through consistent practice. Start small, perhaps just 1 minute daily contemplating the perspective that life is finite. As your comfort grows, extend the practice and deepen the questions. Remember that the purpose isn't to create anxiety, but to enhance life through perspective. If you find the practice creating persistent distress rather than clarity, adjust your approach. Perhaps focus initially on gratitude for the present moment rather than contemplating its passing. For those who find this practice especially challenging, consider beginning with the perspective of limited rather than ending time. Ask how you would live if you had 5 healthy years rather than focusing on death itself. This gentler approach still creates the prioritization benefits while potentially reducing resistance. The consciousness of mortality clarifies our priorities, but the Stoics knew that no human is an island. Epictetus, even having been a slave, developed a revolutionary understanding of relationships that transforms both conflicts and connections. He taught a technique that seems counterintuitive at first, but instantly resolves most interpersonal conflicts. Let's discover how to implement it in your most challenging interactions. The awareness of mortality brings incredible clarity to our priorities. But even with this perspective, there's an area where most of us still struggle daily: our relationships with other people. Have you ever wondered why some people can remain calm and centered during disagreements, while others get immediately triggered and reactive? The difference isn't personality, it's philosophy. Think about your last significant conflict with someone. Maybe your partner made a comment that felt dismissive. Perhaps a colleague took credit for your work, or maybe a friend repeatedly canceled plans at the last minute. Whatever the situation, notice what happened inside you. The immediate surge of emotion, the racing thoughts, the certainty that they were wrong and you were right. This automatic reactivity in relationships is perhaps our greatest source of unnecessary suffering. And no one understood this better than Epictetus, whose journey from slave to respected teacher gave him unique insight into human interaction. Remember, he taught, it is not the person who insults or attacks you who harms you, but your judgment that you have been harmed. This perspective seems almost impossible when we're in the heat of conflict. How can it not be the other person's fault when they're clearly behaving badly? The revolutionary Stoic insight is this: while we can't control others' actions, we have complete sovereignty over our interpretation of those actions. Let's apply this directly to a common scenario. Imagine you text someone important to you and they don't respond for hours, maybe days. The typical reaction chain goes something like this. They haven't responded. They're ignoring me. They don't respect me. I'm unimportant to them. I feel hurt and angry. But this entire chain of suffering stems not from their non-response, the only fact in this situation, but from your interpretation of what their silence means. The Stoic approach would separate the action, no response, from your interpretation, disrespect, lack of caring. Let's try an exercise right now to make this concrete. Think of a recent interaction that bothered you. First, write down just the observable facts. What actually happened that anyone would agree on? Now, write down your interpretation, the story you told yourself about what those facts meant. Finally, generate at least 2 alternative interpretations that could also explain the same facts. For example, if someone was short with you in conversation, the fact is, they gave brief answers and didn't ask questions. Your interpretation might be, they were being rude and don't value me. Alternative interpretations could include, they might be preoccupied with a personal problem, or they might be uncomfortable in social situations. This technique of separating facts from interpretations is what I call role reversal, temporarily stepping out of your perspective to see the situation through different eyes. The Stoics practiced this regularly, not just to reduce conflict, but to develop a more accurate understanding of reality. Epictetus taught 3 levels of responsibility in relationships that remain revolutionary even today. First, you are responsible for your actions, what you say and do. Second, you are responsible for your interpretations, the meaning you assign to others' behavior. Third, you must accept the limitations of others. They will act according to their nature and understanding, not your expectations. This third point is perhaps the most difficult. We suffer in relationships largely because we expect others to behave as we would, to value what we value, to see the world as we see it. When they inevitably don't, we feel betrayed, hurt, or angry. A transformational case I witnessed involved a marriage that was disintegrating over seemingly irreconcilable differences. The husband, naturally organized and punctual, was constantly frustrated by his wife's more spontaneous approach to time and planning. Every late arrival or changed plan felt like a personal affront, a sign she didn't respect him. Through practicing Stoic relationship principles, he began to separate her actions from his interpretations. The fact, she often arrived later than the agreed time. His interpretation, she was deliberately disrespecting him. Alternative interpretations. She had a fundamentally different relationship with time, or she valued flexibility over punctuality. This shift didn't make her suddenly punctual, but it transformed his experience. Instead of feeling disrespected, he could see her behavior as an expression of her different nature rather than a statement about his worth. This created space for practical solutions rather than emotional reactivity. The science behind this approach is compelling. When we perceive social rejection or disrespect, our brains activate the same regions that register physical pain. But when we practice cognitive reappraisal, consciously changing our interpretation of events, we reduce activity in the amygdala, the threat detection center, and increase activity in the prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking center. This doesn't mean becoming a doormat or accepting truly harmful behavior. The Stoics distinguished between preference and attachment. You can prefer that others treat you with respect while not attaching your well-being to whether they actually do. A daily practice for developing this skill is what I call expectation monitoring, becoming aware of your implicit expectations of others. Before important interactions, ask yourself, what am I expecting from this person? What will happen inside me if they don't meet that expectation? Are my expectations aligned with who they've shown themselves to be? This practice creates space between your expectations and reality, reducing the automatic disappointment that occurs when others don't behave as you think they should. Communication itself transforms when approached from Stoic principles. Most of us communicate to get something: agreement, validation, compliance, and feel frustrated when we don't get it. Stoic communication focuses instead on expressing your perspective clearly while remaining detached from how it's received. This approach sounds something like, "I'd like to share my perspective, which you're free to consider or not," rather than, "You need to understand and agree with me." The first creates space for authentic exchange. The second creates pressure and resistance. I worked with someone who transformed their family dynamics using this approach. After years of tense political disagreements at family gatherings, they shifted from trying to change relatives' minds, uncontrollable, to expressing their own values clearly while remaining open to hearing others, controllable. The arguments didn't disappear, but their emotional impact did. I realized I was suffering not because we disagreed, but because I felt responsible for changing their views, they explained. This principle applies powerfully in challenging work environments as well. A common source of workplace stress is difficult colleagues or supervisors. The Stoic approach isn't to try changing them, largely uncontrollable, but to master your own responses, entirely controllable. One practical technique is value-based responding, making choices based on your values rather than others' behavior. If you value professionalism, you remain professional regardless of how others act. If you value honesty, you speak truthfully regardless of whether others do the same. This creates what psychologists call response freedom, the space between stimulus and response where your values, not your reactions, determine your behavior. Viktor Frankl, heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy, called this the last human freedom, the ability to choose one's attitude regardless of circumstances. The Stoics also recognized another relationship trap, taking others' behavior personally when it's rarely about us. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When people injure you, ask yourself what good or harm they thought would come of it. If you understand that, you'll feel no need to be angry." This perspective helps us see that others' actions typically reflect their beliefs, fears, values, and limitations, not their assessment of our worth. The person who cuts you off in traffic isn't making a statement about you. They're likely preoccupied with their own concerns. Try this experiment for one day. When someone does something that bothers you, ask yourself, what might be happening in their life that would explain this behavior? This simple shift from personalizing to contextualizing creates immediate emotional relief. The Stoics understood something modern psychology has confirmed. Empathy reduces conflict. But not just any empathy, specifically cognitive empathy, the ability to understand another's perspective, even when you disagree with it. Studies show that people who practice cognitive empathy experience less interpersonal stress and resolve conflicts more effectively. A powerful practice for developing this skill is the circle of concern, a meditation where you gradually expand your circle of compassion. Begin with yourself, then include loved ones, then acquaintances, then difficult people, and finally, all humanity. This doesn't mean approving of harmful behavior, but recognizing our shared humanity despite differences. This practice changes how you perceive social conflicts. Instead of seeing them as battles to win, you see them as opportunities to understand different perspectives, even when you maintain your own position. One of the most transformative Stoic insights about relationships is that genuine connection comes not from demanding that others meet your needs, but from living according to your values, regardless of how others respond. Epictetus, who experienced the extreme of human relationship challenges as a slave, taught that true freedom comes from focusing on what you can control, your choices, values, and responses, while accepting what you cannot, others' choices, values, and responses. This creates what I call interdependent autonomy, maintaining your center while engaging fully with others. You're neither dependent on others' approval nor detached from meaningful connection. You care deeply about relationships while not making your well-being contingent on specific outcomes. As you practice these principles, you'll notice something remarkable. Your relationships become simultaneously more authentic and less draining. Conflicts still occur, but they no longer derail your inner peace. You can engage with difficult people without absorbing their emotional state. A healthcare provider described this transformation. Before, when a patient became angry, I would either become defensive or absorb their emotion. Now, I can hold space for their feelings without abandoning myself in the process. This isn't just better for me, it's better medicine. Remember that applying these principles doesn't mean your relationships will be perfect. The Stoics were realists about human nature. But it does mean that your experience of relationships will transform. You'll find yourself responding rather than reacting, understanding rather than judging, connecting rather than controlling. The Stoic principles for relationships show us how to interact with others while maintaining our inner peace. But there's another crucial relationship the Stoics considered fundamental: our relationship with our values and virtues. Seneca wrote that no wind is favorable for the sailor who doesn't know which port he's heading for. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Stoics created clarity of purpose through a daily process of alignment with values that you can implement in just 3 minutes a day. Our relationships with others are vital, but the Stoics recognized another relationship that fundamentally shapes everything else: our connection to our own values and purpose. Imagine reaching the end of a busy day, collapsing into bed exhausted, and yet feeling strangely empty, like you accomplished many things, but nothing that truly mattered. How often does this happen in your life? This disconnection between activity and meaning isn't just frustrating, it's the source of what modern psychologists call existential emptiness. In our modern world, we face a paradox that the ancient Stoics somehow anticipated. The more options we have, the less clarity we often feel about our direction. With countless possible careers, relationships, and lifestyles available, many of us find ourselves paralyzed by choice, or worse, drifting through life responding to whatever seems most urgent rather than what's most important. Seneca, who served as advisor to emperors and was one of Rome's wealthiest men, observed this problem even in ancient times. "No wind is favorable to the sailor who doesn't know to which port he is sailing," he wrote. Without clarity of purpose, even success becomes meaningless, just movement without direction. The challenge isn't just external distraction, though that certainly plays a role. The deeper issue is that many of us haven't clarified what truly matters to us. We inherit values from our families, absorb them from our culture, or adopt them from our professional environments without ever questioning whether they align with our authentic nature. The Stoics developed a revolutionary approach to this problem. Rather than looking outward for purpose, they looked inward, to what they called our natural inclinations toward virtue. They believed that each person has inherent values that, when identified and lived, create a sense of meaning regardless of external circumstances. Seneca practiced this through a daily audit of his actions in relation to his values. Each evening, he would review not just what he had accomplished, but whether those accomplishments aligned with his core principles. This wasn't about productivity or achievement in the modern sense. It was about integrity, the alignment between stated values and lived experience. Let's try a simplified version of this practice right now. Take 30 seconds to list your 3 most important values, the principles that you believe should guide your life. These might include things like honesty, courage, compassion, creativity, wisdom, or justice. Write them down or hold them in your mind. Now, estimate what percentage of your time and energy over the past week was genuinely aligned with each value. Be brutally honest with yourself. This exercise is for your benefit alone. Do you notice any gaps between what you say matters and how you actually spend your limited time? Most people discover significant misalignment. The executive who values family but works 70 hours a week. The person who values health but hasn't exercised in months. The creative who values artistic expression but spends all their free time scrolling through social media. This gap creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The uncomfortable feeling that arises when our actions contradict our beliefs. This discomfort isn't something to avoid. It's valuable information signaling the need for realignment. But how do we identify our true values in the first place? The Stoics would argue that genuine values aren't arbitrarily chosen. They're discovered through careful self-examination. They believed that virtuous values are those that align with our nature as rational and social beings. A powerful method for uncovering your core values is what I call the 5 questions technique. Take a few minutes to ask yourself, first, what activities make you lose track of time? When do you experience what psychologists now call flow? Second, what would you still do even if no one ever knew about it or praised you for it? Third, what principles would you refuse to compromise, even if you were offered significant rewards? Fourth, what qualities do you most admire in others? Fifth, in moments of clarity, perhaps during travel, nature experiences, or after overcoming challenges, what has seemed most important to you? Your answers reveal patterns that point toward your authentic values. Not what you think you should value, but what naturally resonates with your deepest self. Once you've identified these values, the next step is creating what the Stoics practiced as morning alignment, a brief ritual connecting your daily actions to your fundamental principles. This doesn't require elaborate preparation or extensive time. 3 minutes at the start of your day can transform everything that follows. Here's a simple practice. Before checking your phone or email each morning, take 3 deep breaths and ask yourself, what value will guide my actions today? Choose one core value to focus on, then identify 3 specific ways you can express that value in your scheduled activities. For example, if your value is wisdom, you might decide to listen fully during a meeting rather than planning your response. Read for 15 minutes during lunch instead of scrolling through social media, and reflect on lessons learned before sleep. These aren't additional tasks. They're ways of approaching what you're already doing through the lens of your chosen value. This morning alignment creates what psychologists call implementation intentions. Specific plans for how you'll act in accordance with your values when opportunities arise. Research shows that these intentions dramatically increase the likelihood of following through compared to general commitments. A business leader I worked with transformed his leadership approach through this simple practice. Rather than beginning each day reacting to the most urgent emails and requests, he spent 3 minutes connecting his day's activities to his core value of developing others. This didn't change his schedule, but it completely shifted his attention and energy in meetings, conversations, and decision-making. Before, he told me, I was efficient but mechanical. Now, the same activities feel meaningful because I'm consciously connecting them to what matters most to me. The Stoics understood something that modern research has confirmed. Purpose doesn't come from what you do, but from why you do it. Viktor Frankl, whose work was heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy, observed that people can endure almost any hardship if they find meaning in it. The reverse is also true. Even pleasant activities feel empty when disconnected from deeper purpose. This operates at 3 distinct levels. First, finding purpose in the present moment, bringing full attention and intention to whatever you're doing. Second, clarifying your role in life, the unique contribution you're positioned to make. Third, connecting to the broader human community, how your efforts serve something beyond yourself. Let's explore how to transform ordinary tasks through purposeful intention. Consider something mundane you do regularly, perhaps commuting, attending routine meetings, or handling administrative tasks. Instead of seeing these as obligations to endure, ask yourself, how can this activity express my values? What quality of attention would make this meaningful? If you value learning, your commute becomes an opportunity for audiobooks or podcasts. If you value connection, routine meetings become chances to truly see and understand colleagues. If you value excellence, administrative tasks become expressions of care and attention to detail. This transformation doesn't require changing what you do, just how you approach it. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Obstacles themselves become opportunities to express values like patience, creativity, or perseverance. I worked with someone who found their job in customer service increasingly draining. Rather than immediately seeking a new position, they experimented with connecting this work to their core value of compassion. They began viewing each interaction as an opportunity to bring kindness to someone possibly having a difficult day. This simple reframing transformed the same tasks from depleting to fulfilling. To deepen this practice, establish a weekly value audit, 15 minutes to review how your actions aligned with your principles. Unlike typical productivity reviews that focus on what you accomplished, this audit asks, how did my actions express my values? Where did I compromise them? What adjustments would create greater alignment? This isn't about perfection. The Stoics were realists about human limitation. It's about conscious course correction, preventing small deviations from becoming major departures from your path. One of the most common obstacles to living with purpose is distraction. Not just external interruptions, but internal fragmentation of attention. The Stoics were remarkably prescient about this challenge, even without our modern technology. Seneca wrote, "To be everywhere is to be nowhere." Observing how people in his time scattered their attention across too many pursuits, resulting in shallow engagement with everything. How much more relevant is this observation in our age of constant notifications and infinite scrolling? Studies suggest the average person checks their phone 150 times daily and switches tasks every 3 minutes. This fragmentation makes sustained purpose nearly impossible. A practical counter-practice is what I call the value filter, a simple question to ask before engaging with any information or activity. Does this align with my core values or distract from them? This creates a conscious boundary between you and the endless inputs competing for your attention. This filter isn't about rigid restriction, but conscious choice. You might still choose to enjoy entertainment or social media, but you do so intentionally rather than by default, and with boundaries that protect your deeper purposes. When making difficult decisions, the Stoics used what we might call a values compass, evaluating options not by potential outcomes, which we can't control, but by alignment with principles, which we can control. When facing a challenging choice, they asked not what will produce the best result, but what action best expresses virtue. This approach transforms decision-making from anxious prediction to principled choice. You can't control whether speaking up in a meeting will be well received, but you can control whether your choice aligns with your values of honesty and courage. Maintaining consistency across different life roles presents another challenge. We often compartmentalize, being one person at work, another with family, another with friends. The Stoics aspired to what they called characterological unity, expressing the same core values regardless of context. This doesn't mean behaving identically in every situation. Contexts naturally require different expressions. It means that the underlying principles remain consistent. If you value honesty, you practice it both in professional communications and personal relationships, adjusting the expression but not the principle. Perhaps the most powerful Stoic insight about purpose is finding meaning in the present moment, rather than deferring it to some future achievement. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." This immediacy transforms even small actions into expressions of purpose. I call this present purpose, finding meaning not in what you will eventually do, but in how you're doing whatever is before you right now. This might be listening attentively to a child, completing a task with excellence, or simply being fully present with your own experience. This perspective liberates us from the trap of conditional purpose. I'll find meaning when I get the promotion, finish the degree, or achieve the goal. Instead, purpose becomes available in every moment through the quality of our attention and intention. The practices we've explored create a powerful foundation for living with purpose, but they require integration into a coherent system. The Stoics understood that isolated practices, however valuable, aren't sufficient. We need a comprehensive approach to philosophical living. Epictetus said that philosophy isn't about discussing what makes a good person, but about being one. In the next chapter, we'll explore how to transform abstract principles into concrete daily habits that anyone can implement immediately. Even with clear values and a strong sense of purpose, we all face a puzzling phenomenon. Why do we resist doing the very things we know will bring us fulfillment? Have you ever set an important goal, started with enthusiasm, and then, inexplicably, found yourself doing everything except the one thing you committed to? This isn't just procrastination. It's a deeper form of self-sabotage that even the most disciplined among us experience. What's fascinating is that this pattern troubled even the most powerful Stoics. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome with unimaginable authority, confessed in his private journals that he struggled to get out of bed in the morning. He wrote to himself, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, 'I have to go to work as a human being.'" This isn't the confession we expect from history's most powerful ruler, yet it reveals a universal truth. Resistance to meaningful action is part of the human condition, not a personal failing. This paradox, why we avoid what matters most, is at the heart of our struggle for meaningful change. Understanding it transforms how we approach discipline entirely. The first liberating truth the Stoics recognized is that resistance is normal, not a sign of weakness or lack of commitment. When you feel that pull away from important work, you're not broken or lazy. You're experiencing a natural human response to change, even positive change. As Seneca observed, it is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that things are difficult. Take a moment right now to identify something important you've been resisting. Perhaps it's starting a creative project, having a difficult conversation, or establishing a healthy habit. Notice the physical sensations that arise when you contemplate taking action. Perhaps a tightness in your chest, a desire to check your phone, or a sudden remembrance of more urgent tasks. This awareness itself is the first step toward overcoming resistance. Marcus Aurelius developed specific strategies for these moments of resistance. When he didn't want to leave his comfortable bed to fulfill his imperial duties, he didn't rely on willpower alone. Instead, he reframed the situation. "I am rising to do the work of a human being," he reminded himself. This wasn't just positive thinking. It was reconnecting to his deepest values in the moment resistance appeared. This method of pre-commitment, creating systems that work even when motivation fails, was central to Stoic practice. They understood that willpower is finite and fluctuating, so they designed environments and routines that made virtuous action the path of least resistance. Let's explore how to apply this to your own resistance. First, Identify your specific form of resistance using what I call neutral observation. For 3 days, simply notice when and how resistance appears without trying to overcome it. Does it manifest as procrastination, distraction, or perhaps as reasonable-sounding excuses? Does it appear at particular times of day or in specific environments? One person I worked with discovered that their resistance to writing always appeared as the sudden urgent need to clean their apartment. Another found that resistance to exercise consistently showed up as, "I'll start tomorrow when I have more energy." By observing these patterns without judgment, they became predictable rather than mysterious forces. The Stoics were masters at what modern psychologists call implementation intentions, specific plans for when, where, and how you'll act, including how you'll handle potential obstacles. Seneca advised, "Before all else, make a definite plan in your own mind of the pattern your life is to follow." This isn't just about scheduling, it's about anticipating resistance and designing around it. The method of pre-commitment works by removing decision points where resistance typically appears. Instead of deciding each morning whether to meditate, you establish a specific trigger, like finishing your first sip of coffee, that automatically initiates the practice without requiring a new decision. Try this right now. Identify one important action you've been resisting, then create a specific implementation intention using this format. After I, existing habit, I will new action at specific location for specific duration. For example, after I brush my teeth in the morning, I will write in my journal at my desk for 5 minutes. This approach addresses one of the 3 levels of resistance the Stoics identified. The first is physical resistance, your body's inertia and preference for comfort. The second is emotional resistance, fears, anxieties, and other uncomfortable feelings associated with the action. The third and deepest is identity resistance, when the action challenges your self-concept or triggers imposter syndrome. For physical resistance, the Stoics employed micro-commitments, breaking actions down into such small steps that they bypass the body's resistance mechanisms. Epictetus taught his students to focus on the first movement only. Just begin, and the first step will reveal the next. If you're resisting exercise, commit only to putting on your workout clothes. If you're avoiding writing, commit just to opening the document and writing 1 sentence. The miracle of micro-commitments isn't the initial tiny action. It's that once begun, continuing becomes remarkably easier. Someone I worked with had been avoiding meditation for years despite knowing its benefits. Using micro-commitments, they pledged only to sit down and take 3 breaths. This minimal commitment bypassed their resistance, and most days, those 3 breaths naturally extended into 10 minutes of practice. The key insight was that resistance concentrates at the starting point. By making starting trivially easy, the rest often follows naturally. For emotional resistance, the fears and anxieties that prevent action, the Stoics practiced what we might call internal dialogue. Rather than fighting against these emotions or being controlled by them, they engaged them in conversation. Seneca would address his fear directly. "Are you afraid of death? Come now, tell me which of these imagined terrors is such that it cannot be faced." This wasn't self-criticism, but curious exploration, examining fears to determine which were rational concerns and which were unfounded anxieties. Try this approach with your own emotional resistance. When you notice anxiety about starting an important project, ask yourself, what specifically am I afraid might happen? How likely is this outcome? What evidence do I have? And if this fear came true, could I handle it? This dialogue doesn't eliminate emotion, but it prevents emotion from controlling your actions. As Epictetus taught, make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. For the deepest level, identity resistance, the Stoics understood that our actions are limited by who we believe ourselves to be. If you don't see yourself as the kind of person who speaks up in meetings, that self-concept will create resistance to doing exactly that, even when speaking up aligns with your values. The Stoic approach to identity resistance was to focus on actions rather than labels. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." This shifts focus from the intimidating question, "Am I a writer?" to the actionable question, "Can I write one sentence today?" Modern research confirms this approach. Studies show that identity-based resistance often dissolves when we focus on specific behaviors rather than comprehensive self-definitions. You don't need to feel like an athlete to put on running shoes and walk around the block. Another powerful Stoic strategy for overcoming resistance was environmental design, modifying your physical space to support your intentions rather than undermine them. Seneca advised his students to physically remove themselves from environments that triggered vice or weakness until their philosophical practice was stronger. Today, this might mean putting your phone in another room while working, preparing your exercise clothes the night before, or creating a dedicated space for your priority work that's free from distractions. The environment shapes behavior more powerfully than most people realize. One study found that students who studied in the same room where they would be tested performed significantly better than those who studied elsewhere. Your mind forms associations with physical spaces that either support or undermine your intentions. Look around your physical environment right now. What aspects of it support your most important work? What aspects create resistance or distraction? One small environmental change can dramatically reduce the willpower required to follow through on your commitments. The Stoics also employed what modern psychologists call contrast thinking, vividly imagining both the costs of inaction and the benefits of action. Epictetus asked his students to consider not just the difficulty of virtuous action, but also the peace that comes from living according to nature and reason. When facing resistance, try this two-part visualization. First, imagine in detail the consequences of continuing your current pattern, how you'll feel in 1 month, 6 months, or a year if nothing changes. Then imagine with equal detail the benefits of taking consistent action, not just the external results, but the internal satisfaction of overcoming resistance. This contrast creates motivational tension that often breaks through resistance more effectively than willpower alone. It works because it engages both emotional and rational systems in your brain, creating alignment between what you logically know and what you emotionally feel. For ongoing resistance management, integrate what I call the resistance check-in, a 30-second practice whenever you notice yourself avoiding important work. Ask 3 questions. What am I feeling in my body right now? What story am I telling myself about this task? What's one tiny step I could take right now? This brief check-in prevents resistance from operating unconsciously, where it's most powerful. By bringing awareness to the process, you transform from being controlled by resistance to observing it with curiosity. Perhaps the most counterintuitive Stoic approach to resistance was practicing what I call radical acceptance, fully acknowledging resistance without judgment before taking action. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This isn't passive resignation, but strategic acceptance that creates freedom to act. When you feel resistance, try saying to yourself, "I'm noticing resistance to getting started. This is normal and human. I can feel this resistance and take action anyway." Thus, this acceptance paradoxically reduces resistance's power by removing the secondary struggle, fighting against the fact that you're experiencing resistance. As you develop these practices, remember that overcoming resistance isn't about achieving perfect discipline. It's about building a relationship with resistance that allows you to move forward consistently despite its presence. As Epictetus taught, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." The techniques for overcoming resistance give us power to follow our chosen path, even when it's difficult. But the Stoics understood that isolated practices aren't sufficient. We need an integrated system for living philosophically. Epictetus said that it's not about discussing what makes a good human being, but being one. In the final chapter, we'll explore how the Stoics integrated all these practices into a coherent system of life, and how you can create your own personalized system that works in any circumstance, starting today. The techniques for overcoming resistance give us power to follow our chosen path, even when it's difficult. But these individual practices, powerful as they are, need something more to create lasting transformation. Imagine waking up knowing exactly how to face any challenge that might arise, with an internal system that functions automatically rather than requiring constant effort. This is what a Stoic life system offers. Not isolated techniques, but an integrated approach to living well in any circumstance. The difference between practicing isolated techniques and having a comprehensive system is like the difference between knowing a few guitar chords and being able to play beautiful music. One gives you elements, the other gives you integration. As Seneca observed, the part cannot be well unless the whole is well. This insight explains why so many attempts at personal growth eventually collapse. They're fragments without a unifying structure. The three great Stoic teachers, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, each created systems adapted to their specific circumstances. Epictetus, who began life as a slave, focused on personal freedom through mental discipline. Seneca, advisor to emperors, developed practices for maintaining integrity amid power and wealth. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, created routines to maintain wisdom and compassion despite enormous responsibility. What's remarkable is that despite their vastly different life circumstances, their systems shared fundamental elements that you can adapt to your own life. The key is creating what I call a three-layer structure: daily, weekly, and seasonal practices that work together to transform philosophy from an intellectual exercise into a lived reality. Let's design your personal Stoic system right now, starting with the daily layer. This forms the foundation, simple practices that become as routine as brushing your teeth. The most powerful approach is creating a morning practice of just 3 minutes that sets your direction for the day. Try this. Take a sheet of paper and write down a 3-minute morning routine that includes 1 minute of dichotomy of control, separating what you can and cannot influence today. 1 minute connecting to your core value for the day, and 1 minute visualizing potential challenges and your virtuous response. This tiny routine, performed consistently, creates a powerful foundation for everything that follows. One person I worked with created this simple morning sequence. After pouring her coffee, she would sit at her kitchen table and first identify what was within her control for the day's most important tasks. Then, she would connect her activities to her core value of creativity. Finally, she would visualize one potential challenge and how she would respond with patience rather than reactivity. These 3 minutes, she told me, completely transformed how I experience my days. I'm the same person with the same job and challenges, but I move through them completely differently. The power of this approach comes from integration, connecting practices to triggers already embedded in your daily routine. Instead of trying to create entirely new habits, which typically fail, you're attaching philosophical practices to existing behaviors like making coffee, showering, or commuting. Think about your current morning routine. What existing habit could serve as a trigger for a brief Stoic practice? Perhaps after brushing your teeth, you could practice a 1-minute gratitude reflection. Or after making your bed, you could recite a specific value you want to embody that day. The key is consistency through connection to established patterns. Beyond the morning foundation, a complete daily system includes what I call intermittent practices, brief moments throughout the day to recenter and realign. These might include a midday pause to practice the separation of facts from judgments, or an evening reflection on lessons learned. These don't require additional time in your schedule. They transform moments you already have. For example, waiting for a meeting to start becomes an opportunity to practice present moment awareness. Walking between locations becomes a chance to reconnect with your chosen value for the day. Moments of frustration become triggers for practicing the pause between stimulus and response. But daily practices alone aren't enough. The second layer, weekly practices, provides deeper integration and course correction. Reserve 20 minutes once per week, perhaps Sunday evening, for what the Stoics called philosophical digestion, processing experiences and adjusting your approach. This weekly ritual includes 3 elements. First, reviewing alignment between your values and actions during the past week. Second, identifying patterns of resistance or reactivity that created difficulty. Third, making specific adjustments to your daily practices based on what you've learned. Someone I worked with discovered through his weekly review that he consistently abandoned his values during meetings with one particular colleague. This awareness allowed him to create a specific pre-meeting practice for just those interactions, addressing the pattern rather than treating each incident as separate. This weekly review prevents the common experience of making the same mistakes repeatedly without learning from them. As Seneca wrote, "Each day acquire something that will fortify you against poverty, against death, indeed against other misfortunes as well." The weekly review ensures you're actually acquiring this wisdom rather than just having experiences. The third layer, seasonal practices, addresses longer-term patterns and deeper questions. Every 3 months, schedule 90 minutes for what the Stoics considered essential philosophical work, examining your fundamental assumptions and overall direction. During this seasonal practice, ask yourself, are my core values still authentic, or have they evolved? How have my daily and weekly practices been working? What deeper patterns of thought or behavior am I noticing? What philosophical texts or ideas do I need to revisit? This 3-layer system, daily foundation, weekly integration, seasonal examination, creates what the Stoics considered essential, philosophy as a lived practice rather than a mere intellectual exercise. As Epictetus insisted, if you didn't learn these things in order to demonstrate them in practice, what did you learn them for? But what makes this system truly powerful is starting with what I call the minimum viable practice, the smallest possible version that still creates meaningful change. Many people fail at philosophical living because they attempt too much at once. Instead, begin with just 3 daily practices, 1 weekly review, and 1 seasonal reflection. A software developer I worked with began with just 3 elements: a morning dichotomy of control practice, midday pauses to question judgments, and an evening gratitude reflection. After establishing this foundation over 1 month, he gradually added other practices. 2 years later, he had transformed his relationship with challenges that previously created significant distress. The key, he told me, wasn't the individual practices, though they were powerful. It was the system, how they worked together to create a completely different way of experiencing life. I'm facing the same challenges, but I'm not the same person facing them. When designing your system, consider the environments where you spend most of your time. Different contexts require different applications of the same principles. How will you practice Stoic principles in your workplace, with family, during leisure time? The system should be flexible enough to adapt while maintaining consistent core elements. One teacher created different versions of the same principles for different contexts. brief breathing practices for the classroom, mental reframing techniques for parent interactions, and deeper reflections for her commute. Same principles, different applications. Remember that this system isn't about perfection, but about recovery and growth. The Stoics understood that everyone fails to live philosophically at times. What matters is how quickly you notice the deviation and return to your practices. As Epictetus taught, if you have been honored with a duty beyond your power, decline it and be honest about your capacities. This perspective transforms how you relate to inevitable setbacks. Instead of seeing missed practices as failures that justify abandoning the system, you see them as valuable information about where adjustments are needed. Perhaps your morning practice is too long or your triggers aren't effective. The system evolves through these learnings. Supporting your system through community is another essential element the Stoics emphasized. Seneca wrote letters to friends specifically to reinforce philosophical principles. Marcus Aurelius began his journal by acknowledging those who taught him valuable lessons. Epictetus created a school where students practiced together. Today, this might mean finding even one person who shares your interest in practical philosophy. Meeting monthly to discuss challenges and insights creates accountability and deepens understanding. If finding such a person locally is difficult, online communities offer alternatives, though the Stoics would caution about the difference between virtual discussion and practice in daily life. As your system develops, you'll notice subtle but significant markers of progress. You'll respond rather than react to provocations. You'll recover more quickly from setbacks. You'll make decisions from values rather than impulses. These changes often appear first to others before you notice them yourself. A healthcare professional who established a Stoic life system received unexpected feedback during a performance review. Your colleagues have noticed you remain calm and focused during emergencies in a way that helps everyone work better, her supervisor noted. The practices had created changes visible to others before she fully recognized them herself. Measuring progress in philosophical living requires different metrics than conventional goals. Instead of external achievements, notice changes in your internal responses. Do you create less unnecessary suffering for yourself through judgments? Do you recover more quickly from disappointments? Do you make choices more consistently aligned with your values? A simple tracking method is keeping what the Stoics would recognize as a philosophical journal. Not elaborate reflections, but brief notes on challenges faced and lessons learned. Reviewing this journal periodically reveals patterns of growth that might otherwise go unnoticed in the day-to-day experience of life. As we conclude this exploration of Stoic practices, remember that the ultimate aim isn't philosophical knowledge, but philosophical living. As Epictetus said, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. The system you create isn't about understanding Stoicism intellectually. It's about embodying its principles in your daily choices. We began this journey discussing the universal struggle for peace of mind and purpose in a chaotic world. We've explored how the Stoics, ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, developed practical systems that have endured for over 2,000 years. You now possess these same tools that transform the lives of emperors and slaves, leaders and ordinary citizens. The true power of Stoicism isn't in knowing these principles, but in living them daily. As Epictetus said, don't explain your principles, demonstrate them in action. Your Stoic journey begins with the next choice you make. Not tomorrow, not when you're ready, but right now, in this moment. What question will you ask yourself before reacting? What small value-aligned action will you take today? What judgment will you question? The Stoic path isn't about perfection, but consistent progress, one small step at a time toward the person you've chosen to become.